Right, so a doping scandal is making the wrong kind of headlines at the Winter Olympics in Beijing, but drugs in sport is something that South Africa has already experienced. The almost desperate need to reach the top seems to be persuading some to turn to performance-enhancing, often illegal substances. Sports writer Clinton van der Berg has touched on the subject in his book Guns and Needles. He joins us in studio to unpack this murky subject. A very good afternoon, Mr. van der Berg. Thanks for taking the time to chat to the sports fans on today on eNCA. I want to start with the title of your book. Tell me about the guns in Guns and Needles.
Very good question. So guns is a double entendre. So in the first instance, you've got the traditional meaning of guns, which is a weapon, of course. But in bodybuilding, you know, if you show off your biceps, those are your guns. And traditionally, the kind of epitome of a tough or strong physical male is the size of his arms. You know, that's a sign of his strength. Hence the title Guns and Needles.
Clinton, I mean, you are so clued up with the world of doping. And in fact, I read your book yesterday, so excited about what you get to unpack on the show just shortly. But talk to me about your motivation behind the book and also your early introduction to gymming in particular.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I've been around sport for about 30 years, writing it professionally, been around sportsmen. And interestingly, through those 30 years, one of the common themes that runs throughout, regardless, late 80s and then right through to nowadays, has been the prevalence of steroids, substance abuse, schoolboy use of it, that kind of thing. And it piqued my interest. So there was one particular story about a young girl who was caught in 1995. I followed her story. I rediscovered. I found her. She's a now middle-aged woman. And so finding her essentially lit the touch paper for me. That's what got me really excited. And then I started pulling all the different strands in, and I was staggered at the levels of steroid taking, supplements, illegal substances, that kind of thing. And I just felt it was a story that was compelling and needed to be told.
Can you please describe that to the sport fans on eNCA? Lisa De Villiers, on the eve of the 1995 Rugby World Cup, is busted for being one of the youngest, to be caught and found guilty for doping. How was it eventually meeting her, and why was it so important to tell her story?
Well, if you remember, well, early, you're probably too young, but early 90s, you know, we were this young democracy, and we came sort of blinking into this new world, the Rainbow Nation. Everything like that, and I felt that Lisa came to epitomize that. You know, a little bit of innocence, a little bit of naivety. She was 14 years old. She was busted with steroids, nandrolone, and she was on the front page of the New York Times, youngest to ever test positive on Earth. I mean, it was a staggering story. She was a sprinter, schoolgirl, a wide-eyed and innocent, some said. Just a really remarkable story. So she was out in the East Rand, and of course she was thrown out of athletics. Found her way back after a ban, but it was a very sad story, very twisted as well, lots of different dynamics at play. And of course she has regrets and she looks back on it, but she also has perspective, which I found very interesting. So to reconnect with her, and she said, it's time to tell my story, which was amazing. Her father, who was a big influence in her life, he had died 9 years before, so he was out the picture. Certainly her coach, who she fell out very badly with, he was out the picture, but I spoke to him. Still very upset about what went on, but her story is gripping from beginning to end. It really is quite amazing.
Clinton, having said that, South Africa's long history with doping in sports is an alarming one and a very dark one as well. I mean, the question here is, what is the root cause to many going towards performance-enhancing drugs as the answer to be better than your peer, to be better than the best in the continent and the rest of the world?
It's a good question. I don't think it's germane to South Africa as the root cause, but typically there's a number of reasons. The one is you want success and you're hungry for success. And of course South Africa has this big obsession with sport, and that's fine. There's no problem with that. But it's often a win at all costs attitude. So you have that, and then you have athletes who get injured, but then there's a lot of pressure on them to recover from injury. And what steroids do is they help you repair as well. So there's pressure on them to come back from injury. Often it's linked to contracts. You know, if you're not playing, your contract could end. So that's problematic. But I think what's particularly unique with South Africa is how it's seeped down into, you know, schoolboy sport as well, which is incredibly disturbing, because in many of these cases, or most of these cases, it's minors who are taking it. And in some cases as well, it's parents enabling it as well. So it's a very unhealthy dynamic within our sport, notwithstanding the great successes we often have without steroids.
I mean, doping has been part of school sports for a very long time, as you mentioned, in South African sports, and especially schoolboy rugby. But it almost feels like anyone can get away with murder. Is there any stricter measures that have been put into place? And even if there are, I've got a great sense that, of course, someone has been able to find a way to hack the system.
Quite right, and I think the easiest way now is, you log onto the internet. It'll take you 5 minutes to find a supplier. You source it out of China or Europe or wherever it is, and you can get it quite easily. So that's the one problem. Of course, it's not all cheap. However, what I've come to discover, and the word from the South African Institute for Drug-Free Sport, is it cuts across all demographics now. It didn't used to be the way like that. So that's certainly changed. It's just... it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere now. It's very easy to get. But I must say, there's certainly measures. SAIDs do a lot of good work in education, things like that. SA Rugby take things in hand. The various provinces try as well. And some schools have really been quite alarmed by it, and they put programs in place to counteract the dangers of steroids. However, they don't all do it.
Yes.
And many fall through the cracks, and that's why we continue to get busts. We continue to get schoolboys who test positive.
You speak on the education of performance-enhancing drugs and, of course, helping those involved in sports at a high level to be careful. Of course, them working as well with anti-doping agencies. But is that the answer? Because I do feel that with every generation and in every year, there's just a new drug that comes up, and these scientists can't keep up.
It's a very good question, and in many ways, it's a cat and mouse game. So the moment the scientists or the medical people get on top of an issue, suddenly there's a new drug, and then they've got to chase and find new ways. However, the one thing that is occurring more and more often is you're getting whistleblowers. So guys will say, and there's certain instances within South African sport where guys will go to SAIDs and say, listen, I put my hand up, I'll cop to it, and perhaps for a lighter sentence or something like that, let me work with you. Let me tell you the loopholes that you're missing. Let me tell you how I was getting away with it. And in fact, SAIDs, to their credit, they listen and they want to learn, so that you have this kind of strange relationship that develops between the juicer and the legislator or the person who's in charge of catching them.
Why don't rely on your natural aptitude? I mean, what is it amongst human beings that pushes them to go this far? Surely coach has got great ethics, athlete as well. I mean, I just don't see it.
Well, I think the reality is that it helps you win. And in many ways, it sometimes guarantees you win, especially in the sports of small margins, like athletics, tiny margins, no question. And that's where you see a lot of it as well. In rugby, there's this enormous pressure on boys to develop, to get big, to get strong. And a guaranteed way of doing that is to take juice.
You mentioned athletics, you mentioned rugby. I want to bring in this part of in the interview, the big three of sports in South Africa: rugby, football, cricket. Do we have doping cases? Do we have probably the most doping cases in those sporting codes? Or do we have that happening in other sports that are not so famous and popular, like boxing, like cycling? And in the book, there are many examples that you do mention, Clinton.
That's a very good question. If I can go to the big three. So rugby traditionally goes with the hardcore steroids. And often the old school stuff that was out in the 80s and the 90s, I mean, it's become a little bit more sophisticated, but there's still that use. But cricket and local football typically go the recreational route. There have been exceptions, a couple of steroid cases and things like that, but mostly it's cost prohibitive. And in cricket, it certainly it's not seen as a way to assist you in any way. So it's the recreational drugs, and there are many examples of that. Also illegal substances, guys taking flu medicine, things like that. However, we've had many cases in cycling, as you mentioned. We've had many cases in boxing. And in boxing, the rules governing boxing are chaotic, absolutely chaotic. And more times than not, guys get away with it. You kind of have an excuse, whatever, and they say it's fine. And you can get caught in South Africa, and you can go next week and you can fight in Germany, no problem.
How is that possible?
Well, it's nuts. It's because there isn't a single federation that oversees boxing. So boxing is just, as I call it in the book, it's a red light district of sport.
Wow, I love what you're saying there. I mean, I was in particular taken by Arthur Bwakanawa, who was leading the doping program in East Germany between the 60s and 70s. I was so surprised at the number of Olympic game medals Over the 30 years, between the 70s and the early 2000s, that he helped, most of the athletes in East Germany, achieve. How was that possible? And how did Athletics South Africa allow a man like that to become the chief consultant with Athletics South Africa back in the years?
I know, it's staggering. I mean, so he was part of the Stasi, and that was state-sponsored doping. Interestingly, there's a modern parallel with what's going on in Russia now as well.
Yes.
But they felt it was terribly important that they needed to start winning medals on the international stage. So they went after Urbite, which is interesting in and of itself. There was criticism, and I remember the leadership at the time said, "We will get him. We don't care. It's South Africans. We're very forgiving people. He must come across." Anyway, it didn't happen. It fell over, although they did eventually appoint him. And it was messy, and predictably there was controversy around him and certain athletes and all sorts. He was linked to something with Pillay, the sprinter. He was mentioned with Caster Semenya, those kind of things.
Yes.
But it ended very badly for him, and he hot-footed out of here very quickly. Interestingly, Australia also pursued him. There was a row there, and they just put an end to it. They didn't appoint him.
I mean, in particular, can we speak about Caster Semenya? Do you believe that Eckhart Arbeit's relationship with Athletics South Africa might have affected Caster Semenya in the future, and especially with what we've seen has recently happened? Of course, World Athletics has complained, well, not complained, but have stated that she's got a problem in her genetics makeup, and that's the reason why she cannot compete.
Yes, but I think the link with her and Arbeit was very tenuous. I don't think there was any suspicion of doping or anything like that. It was just felt that he was a negative influence and wasn't going to be helping South African athletics to any great degree.
All right, happy to hear that. Speak to me about your relationship with the anti-doping man. I think his name is Khalid Khalant. How has he helped you with getting these findings and the facts, to the T in the book?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we met for the first time about 5 years ago in Rosebank in Joburg, and I was quite intrigued by him because it's a very interesting job. His job essentially is to go after the dopers and things like that, but also to hear their stories. And he's a very interesting man because he's not a typical kind of sports leader in the sense he's not arrogant or anything like that. He's very much a people person, and in some instances he has quite sympathy for the athletes. He understands the kind of sporting environment. He understands the pressures and things like that. And I think he does an outstanding job with a very small department, not a huge budget or anything like that. And so on the one hand, people say, but the South African numbers are so high, and it's true, they are very high. But he can counter that, and I would agree with him that they're high because our testing is quite good. It's quite thorough. We do a lot of tests at great cost often, and he pursues people who take steroids. And often, for instance, they have partnerships with people in criminal intelligence. They work with those guys. They had a big bust in Cape Town last month, where they came in and hundreds of thousands of rands worth of steroids were discovered in a factory. So he works with these people, and he's quite creative in his way of tackling the steroid problem.
Let's speak about the athletes, the sportsmen, the sportswomen that are the most valuable asset in all of this. How do we protect their careers? How do we protect them from falling victim to those who would literally put a gun to your head and keep you in the corner and say that if you don't try out this sample of calf blood that might help you consume oxygen a little bit better, you might be dead in the next 24 hours?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that the most important is education. They've got to know. What I discovered talking to several athletes, the naivety is staggering. And of course, subsequently, when they've been banned, the regret, and almost always it's never worth it. So I'd say read the book. You can hear the stories, and they end almost all badly.
All right.
There's no happy stories about taking steroids. It's absolutely not.
Will South Africa ever reach a point where they are treated just like Russia, and now at the Winter Olympic Games in Beijing, where they are competing under a neutral flag? Can we ever get there based on the staggering cases that you have found and findings in this book?
No, I don't think so, because I think the exception is that the Russian is clearly state-sponsored. I mean, that's been proven. There was a McLaren report. There were other reports as well that say that, and that's never been the case in South Africa. It's never been suggested as much, anything like that. And although we care very much about sport, I don't think government really wants to be putting cash into us winning medals that way.
All right. In closing, Mr. van der Berg, just your last words regarding guns and needles.
I'd say I love storytelling, And South Africa is full of fantastic stories. And what I've tried to do is put the story together, and I just hope people enjoy the read. They are staggering stories.
Fantastic. Clinton van der Berg just speaking to us about his book, Guns and Needles, and insight, of course, in the world of doping, something that I'm sure a lot of sporting fans in South Africa will be proud to get their hands on. This book, I'm sure it's going to be something that you do love. Of course, eNCA continues with Today. Back to you.